All right, let's go ahead and get this kicked off. First of all, thank you everyone for braving the rain. I know rain, like sprinkling of rain here, just sort of freaks people out. Thank you for braving it. I really appreciate it. Hi everybody, I'm Keith Casey. I'm the organizer for this Austin API meetup. Do we have any first timers? First timers, just give me a wave. Cool. Look around the room. Look around the room. You're not alone. All right. So thank you everybody. If you found us, that's a good sign, but if you want to keep plugged into what Austin API is doing throughout the year, we're austinapi.com. That redirects to the meetup group, and Austin API on Twitter. One of the things we try and do throughout the week and throughout the month is like retweet interesting API news and things that are stuff that's going on. If you're interested in the wider Austin tech community, there's ATX Tech Events. That's a Twitter account that just tweets about what's going on in the community. So regardless of language or technology or whatever, there's probably something there for you. Let's see. We haven't met in a while, have we? No, I think our last meetup was October. And we took November off for API Strat. That was the API Strategy and Practices Conference. Who was there? Okay, good number of people. Our speakers. What were you excited about? Bonnie, what were you excited about?
I just took a bite of a protein bar.
She just took a bite. She's excited about protein. Taylor, do you want to share something with us?
I really met a lot of awesome people who were super in love with documentation. And
Excellent.
that makes me really happy when I meet other people as passionate about documentation.
Fantastic. Any other speakers, attendees? You want to say something cool you learned or found out or somebody you met? Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. The company that owns Kelly Blue Book, I can't remember the name, they're actually shipping bursts of containers down Rabbit SHQ and creating enterprises that are subsidiaries of the corporate. So they were actually duplicating the entire business as opposed to just spinning up another web farm. I thought that was really fascinating.
That's crazy.
Yeah, they
That's
do
awesome.
Kelly Blue Book, and when they do these auctions all over the country, they just spin up a separate company, they do their business, everybody comes in, and then the company spins away, so who do you sue? It's gone.
Okay, APIs as a legal protection.
That's what I got out of it.
I mean, the one thing that I noticed that I thought was really interesting is that the prevalence of people using Docker in production has definitely gone up in the last year. Like a year ago, you ask a room full of people, who's using Docker in production? No one. So I think that's really cool in containerization. And that's where the movement is really interesting to me.
Nice. One thing I thought was awesome is that myself, Jason, Damon Clinkscales, we busted our butts to sort of build up this community and bring API Strat here. And the fact that we had some of the best and brightest API people in the world come and spend 3 days in Austin, Texas, I think is just like mind-blowing. I mean, it was some of the best and brightest. So there's people that are creating Swagger and Raml and little known, but the Postman team, give me just a wave. Postman actually has an office here in Austin. So if you use Postman, say hello to those guys.
Postman is awesome.
Who doesn't know what Postman is? Okay, you guys have some work to do.
They don't look like they're from Bangalore.
Postman.
No, we don't look like
What's up with that?
No,
Bangalorean?
they totally look Indian. What are you talking about? So Postman is a tool, it's a Chrome plugin module extension, however you want to describe it, that is like the Swiss Army knife of being able to make API requests. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely check it out. We will get those guys up here in a couple months, maybe?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure, okay, cool. Let's see. One thing did want to sort of housekeeping wise, one of our glorious leaders, Jason Harmon, has stepped down. It wasn't a Highlander thing, no one lost their head. But it is a matter of, we're looking for a couple people to give me a hand in actually running this group on a regular basis. It's really tough. We respond to email occasionally, we post a meetup schedule, we find speakers, and occasionally we find sponsors who are willing to chip in, what, $100? Yeah, it's $100 a month.
100 to 300.
100 to 300 a month to do stuff. So if you're interested in lending a hand in this community, please let me know. I'm Casey Software, that's C-A-S-E-Y. Software on Twitter. Just drop me a note and we'll talk from there. Let's see. Anything else before we?
I don't think so. It's too early to talk about upcoming events.
Yeah. There's not much going on right now. It's just a little bit quiet. Let's see. Some quick surveys. Who is building and supporting APIs for your company versus using others' APIs? Who are building and supporting for your company? Okay. Who's primarily using other companies' APIs? Okay, okay. Let's see, of the people building and supporting APIs, is your target audience internal to your group or external to your company? Internal? Okay, external. Okay, cool. Let's see, roles. Developers, give me a hand. Lots and lots of developers. Okay, my screen keeps going to sleep. Docs or developer experience people. Okay, cool, couple. Designers, UX people. One. Well, oh, 1.5. 1.5? Welcome.
All of the above.
All of the above. Ooh. Let's see, who are just API curious? Okay, couple, handful. All right, that's great. Okay, last question. Language of choice. Who primarily works in Python? One. Okay, PHP. Okay, a couple more. Let's see, C#. Ooh, cluster over here. Ruby. 1. 2. All right, Java. A few more. JavaScript. Let's see, what am I missing?
Go.
Go. Okay, a few more. What else am I missing?
Oh, Camel.
Fortran. No, we actually have Fortran in our stack, to clarify. Let's see, anything else? Cool. We just try and get a sort of gauge on like where people are, what people are doing. If you think you're the only person working in your particular stack at Austin, you're wrong. Okay. Odds are there's somebody else in your room that's working in a similar situation, whether it's a Go API for external customers, or you're struggling with documentation, or you're trying to figure out user experience. Odds are there's somebody in this room that's doing the same thing as you, okay? So don't feel like you're all alone. Connect with them here, please. Connect with them through Austin API or whatever that's going on. So without further ado, let's kick off with Jason. Thank you, everybody.
So as Keith mentioned, I'm kind of wrapping up my organizer duties and stepping back from that for the year. So it got me in the mood of, we were chatting about what are we going to do for a speaker in January, and I thought I want to look back at like the last 3 years that we've put this thing together and meet regularly with all these great folks. What have I personally learned during that period of time, which for me has been really intense. I've been kind of cobbling with APIs off and on since sort of 2009, 2010, in terms of building them, and certainly longer in the varying forms of them. So I'll warn you, if you're a hardcore developer and you came here to learn how to code something, I'm probably going to disappoint you, because I think I am pretty process and product perspective these days. So I think it's kind of looking at, if I could start over from scratch and build an API program today, what are the things that I would be thinking about? And so the hope is if you're somewhere in that spectrum of the process, that you'll pick something up from it. Having, personally, I currently work at PayPal and Braintree, Braintree being a startup that we acquired a few years back. So pretty big scale. Braintree's actually pretty big scale too, but a smaller company. I worked at UShip before that, built a program from scratch there. So I've kind of like hit a couple of different perspectives in the last few years, and what I always try to extract out is like, what are the immutable things? Like, what are the things that, no matter the size and scale of my operation, no matter the style of my company and the culture and whatever, what are the quintessential elements of building any API program, whether it be internally facing, externally facing, or just partners or whatever. There's always these things that just work, and I'm always trying to kind of collect those. So the other thing that I tend to collect, my job at PayPal has been kind of a dedicated API designer, essentially consulting with a bunch of different teams. And to me, that's a job of collecting mistakes, because my job has to be trying to educate folks on, hey, you're doing this thing and I've seen this 50 times before, and I'll tell you where it leads and it's a bad place. So we'll kind of start with that side of the house, and then we'll sweep back to, okay, now what are the things that you should do regardless of some of your mistakes? And there are obviously a lot of things that I'm not covering here, but hopefully those will give you kind of some, higher or low points depending on how you look at it. So, as I said, we'll start with the don't, this being do's and don'ts. It probably should have been don'ts and do's. Mostly because it's easier again, the way I think about things, it's easier to avoid the problem than it is to do it right in most businesses. How many of you are working at sort of startup kind of smaller companies, or how you self-identify as smaller startup company? Yeah. So as you know, it's all kind of a mess, right? And in truth, if you haven't worked at the bigger companies, it's all kind of a mess too. I think that's one of the great things that I've loved about this group is that we've encouraged speakers, please come bring us your dirty laundry. Show us what's gone wrong so that, smaller guys out there can learn from it and maybe not repeat those mistakes when you get up to 10 or 12,000 people, right? The truth is it's kind of all messy, so we're all making mistakes. Let's learn from each other and share it. So the first one, and I see this a lot, I kind of end up helping out, smaller companies, startups, one-man operation kind of, new idea things in looking at their API designs outside of PayPal even. And one of the biggest things I see there is, I call it design by facsimile. So I have a weird habit, if you haven't seen me speak before, of always using images from Wikipedia, like, what is it, Commons license or whatever. So this is actually a fax machine from the 20s. I thought it was really cool that it was a fax machine in the 20s. So they say that or Pablo Picasso actually said once that good artists copy and great artists steal. And I think there's some enigma in that statement, but it's so insanely common that someone will show me something and I'll say, I think there might be a better way to do what you're trying to do. And they say, well, I'm basically doing what Twitter does in their API, or basically doing what Facebook does in their API, or whatever. How many of you have gone and built an API from scratch yourselves? Probably quite a few based on the earlier poll. What was the first thing that you did? Go do a survey of APIs to try to find the ones that you liked? Yes? Yeah. So I don't think that that's a bad idea, but there's a bad correlation in the idea that popular must be good, right? And that's actually not directly a criticism of, I'm not picking on Facebook and Twitter, I'm really not.
It's
What
called
I'm saying,
Trump corollary.
what's that?
It's called the Trump corollary.
Trump corollary. I'm not really saying that they're bad, I'm saying that they probably aren't good designs for what you're trying to do. So, and on top of it, I think it's always important to think, what's the vintage of this API? I always say API design is it's a little bit like being an archaeologist if you're gonna go do one of these surveys. You need to know, when did they design it? Because, a lot of sort of Facebook, Twitter kind of stuff, their origins were in 07, 08. When this stuff, nobody really knew what they were doing. Everybody was making it up. And I guarantee you, partially because I know some of the people there, they're not real comfortable with what's out there publicly. Nobody's super proud of it at this point, but it exists, right? I mean, there are issues with it fundamentally that would be nice to fix, but when you have, X billion consumers, it's hard to change it. So the point is that designing just by going out and looking at what other people did, because they're a big name in the API world, might not be the best way to go. You run the risk of, as I said, sort of imitating an outdated set of design concepts that, in the sort of, call it 8 years, we've had to sort of mature through APIs or REST APIs becoming a thing. There's newer ideas that we've learned work better. So to some extent, knowing that vintage of how old is this API tells you something about how effective is it, just in terms of pure design, not taking use cases into account. But there's also some risks in security, in my opinion. I think a lot of things that were being done in sort of the late aughts maybe weren't the most secure approaches, and a lot of newer APIs don't do those things. So, using the authorization header is about as simple as I can say it on that, versus passing things around in URLs is probably the thing you see the most often. And really just not taking advantage of what HTTP can do for you. Using post where you shouldn't be makes it uncacheable, as a very simple example. But if you're just copying what someone else did and you don't think about the fact that they didn't want it cached, it might set you up for a performance problem that you didn't really think forward about. So the better approach to this is learn something about HTTP. I think for those of us who've been building APIs for a while, you find yourself sitting down with a glass of wine in the evening with, an RFC, that was never accepted, and reading history, right? Or reading through the RFC 7200 series and remarking on how much more clear it is in the RFC 2616. For those of you that don't read RFCs, these are the things that define how HTTP works. But if you haven't spent all that time and sunk parts of your life into reading plain text formats, go look at least, there are some style guides out there, and this is something I've been pressing a lot of folks to do, is if you have some sort of internal standards, scrape out the core bits of that explain how you decided to build your API, and don't call it an API design patterns guide, because the Java guys will run after you with torches and pitchforks. I promise you, that's what they do. I called it a style guide for PayPal, but I really honestly was following in the footsteps of like Heroku, who I think did a great job at just putting something out on GitHub. And it turns out a lot of people who are smart enough to realize I shouldn't copy, I should go look for principles. That was their starting point. So now there's actually a number of companies who've gone off and done it, and I think the more that we're publishing and sharing these ideas, the better that our sense of shared standards, if you will be. Because there are really no REST API standards, right? It's a design pattern, or sorry, I said design pattern. Now I've set myself up to be torched and pitchforked. It's a set of design constraints. And we'll touch more later on listening to customers and how that can affect how you design things, but it fits in better later. So that's kind of our first thing, facsimile, design by facsimile. The second is build it and they will come. How many of you have built an API and you were super proud and you did everything right and nobody used it? Anyone? Don't be ashamed, it's okay. We're here to fail together. Yeah, I've been involved. This is a remarkably common story. When you get people into dark, quiet places and a little alcohol, you'll hear their stories of how they built something. They slapped together some reference docs for it. They sent out some emails, they let people know it existed, and then it just sat there. I think to me the first step is that there's a lot more to it than just reference. And I certainly resonate with Taylor up here that the doc side of the API world is critical. Understanding what it is that you're actually putting out there is really hard for people when all they know is what are the URLs, what do the fields mean, what are their names, parameters, all that kind of stuff. It's hard to kind of grok like, what do you mean? So tell me a story. Right? Human brains are fundamentally wired to interpret stories. Tell me what this thing does. Tell me how it works. What are the features? What does it mean to me to use your API in terms of, guide me through that process. So in addition, showcase it a little bit. How easy is it for me to call it? Curl or it didn't happen, right? Give me a little curl snippet to see how complicated is this thing to call so I can get a quick sense of it. Put together some code samples, all that sort of stuff. These things all add comfort. For those of you who primarily use APIs, would you concur that these are things that you look for that make you comfortable? Yes? Slight head nods, that's good. So I think that's a big part. Maybe you've built the perfect API and it fits all your use cases perfectly. Adding that layer on is going to help kind of draw people in. The onboarding piece is going to start to make more sense. So now that maybe somebody happened to find you and they start to use it, maybe it wasn't the perfect API. Maybe you missed some things. So now this feedback loop starts to be really important. We want to know how we screwed up when we built it, but we have to be where the developers are to find out. So finding out what those channels are, and I guess I didn't put it in here, but like your Stack Overflow and Twitter, and maybe you have a blog with some discus feedback or something like that. Finding out what it is that people are having trouble with is a challenge unto itself. But the question then is, can you be responsive? Can you answer questions, even if they're stupid? Can you listen to criticism of what you did wrong and prioritize fixing it? Because I can tell you from experience, it's the hardest thing to put that at the top of your product backlog and say we're going to fix stuff. So make that a priority. So we've put together something that draws people in. They're wanting to onboard. Maybe they've started to try it. They kind of botched things up. What about those that never found us at all? They don't know that your API exists. I mean, like, it's been weird for the last couple of years working at PayPal. I tell people, they go, hey, who are you? I'm Jason. I work at PayPal. Have you heard of it? Like, it's a joke, right? You laugh. But coming from like UShip or something, a lot of people don't know who you are. They don't know what you do. So developer marketing is super, super tough. This is a really hard nut to crack, and I think I'm not convinced that anybody does it perfectly. There are certainly some who do pretty well. For a long time now, hackathons have been like the thing. Like, you hire somebody who says evangelist, they have a strong liver, a good travel fortitude, and they can go hit every conference, bang, 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 shake hands, kiss babies, and everybody loves your API. But I feel like those times, that little golden age that some kids out of college had, I don't know who it was, this guy, but those times have waned, and hackathons, I think, for better or worse, I think there was certainly a lot of great things that came out of it. There was a lot of horrible marketing-driven things that came out of it. Those times are passing, and hackathons as a developer marketing tool are pretty tainted at this point. So if that's your plan, pump the brakes. Evangelism, I think, to me, I think there's a bad connotation with the word at this point from sort of these marketing-driven initiatives. To me, it's developer advocacy. It's that you're the voice for developers who want to use your API. But how do you become that voice? You have to talk to them. You have to be where they are. So to some extent, there's a weird blurry line happening. You'll notice blogging, support, docs. These were all the things we talked about a minute ago. So the question is, do you have dedicated support staff? Do you have dedicated evangelism? To some extent, there's a merging of those things that can happen. And getting that to fit your organization, I think, is different every time. I've never seen it the same. But finding a way to get field feedback to the developers in a way that's healthy, that's kind of the key. Call it evangelism, call it advocacy, call it whatever you will. That's the kind of important stuff. The really successful APIs know exactly what developers in the field are running into, and they're super responsive to it. The docs get updated quickly, the bugs get fixed quickly. That's what you really want to try to get to. Integration marketing, I think, is a term I picked up from Adam Duvander. I don't even remember where Adam works anymore, but he's moved around a lot. The basic thing is you go to use some API or some platform, and there's, you go to settings, and in settings it says turn on integrations, and you've got 10, 20, 30 different little sliders you can pull that suddenly light up the ability for the data in that platform to be pushed out somewhere else or to be populated from somewhere else. There's kind of an ecosystem of these integration-driven APIs that play you nice with each other, and being part of that ecosystem is kind of blanket termed, I think, as integration marketing. And it's an interesting kind of new developing space. Some good examples, Slack just recently launched their app directory, and if you think about it from Slack's perspective, that's folks using their API to make things happen in Slack. So for them, it's an API-driven way of, it's an API marketing tool. Certainly there's a lot of other business model components to factor into why that makes sense, but that's what it's all about. IFT, of course, is a pretty easy to understand example of you want your app to show up in this big directory, so you need to make some shim for your API for IFT to use. Anybody not familiar with IFT? Okay, you should go look at it. I would do more explanation, but it's you, Henny. It's your fault. Number 3. So were we okay there? I kind of sped past. Okay.
There was one thing that you hit us with a while ago when we had a meeting at UShip that really drove it home for us, which was making the API available on other platforms by way of those SDKs. So
yeah.
It's, for us from a developer marketing standpoint, it's like, if you're on this platform and yeah, you're gonna understand the API and you're gonna use it, but hey, we're gonna give you the rules of the road to integrate this into your application. And that was one of the things that when you're a Ruby on Rails guy or you're a Python guy, curl's great, but when you start providing those people those kind of patterns with those SDKs, that's when they're really happy, right?
It's in the dues.
Oh.
I wanted to hear your point. It was very well put, and that's awesome that from experience it's worked. Any more questions on this number 2, sort of build it and they'll come? We built it, they didn't come. We had to do more things. Yeah.
How does this change the role of the product manager? Or are they just trying to catch up?
How many of you who are building APIs have a product manager who knows what the API is?
That should be concerning to everyone.
I would say, as a counterpoint to that question, that the role of an API product manager as a technical product management role is still very much developing. And there's, yep.
Sunbird does something really interesting. They have Matt, I forget his last name starts with a B. He's a developer experience and API product manager, and so he kind of struggles that like experience and making sure like knowing actually what developers need and want, what they're struggling with, and with prioritizing things for the API. So
Yeah.
it's really good.
I really believe that today there are a handful of extremely talented individuals, which that sounds like one of them, who pull this off. But if you're in an organization where you need 10 or 15 of them, there's no one to go hire. I think I'll come back to this as part of our wrap up, and it'll make a little bit more sense. But you're on the right track, yeah.
Just to pull the curtain aside for a minute, from Twilio in the early days, everyone saw us at the hackathons, and that's what they associated everything with. To be honest, all the other stuff was going on behind the scenes. It's just that didn't get any of the visibility. So even when people say, oh, well, Twilio did this, Twilio did everything on that list. Okay, so don't let, oh, well, here's what everyone assumes. Don't just pass that along and assume that that's the case. We did every single thing on that list. In fact, Tuesday was my support day for the first 6 months I was there. Every Tuesday, I will support.
Yeah, I think that the risk with APIs is that those who gravitate to building APIs tend to be your seasoned back-end developers who haven't touched a UI in a long time and maybe haven't talked with humans in a long time. So forcing those really good back-end developers to get into a very uncomfortable space of talking with customers and not getting in trouble is a good thing. It's good for those individuals, for their personal development, and it's good in the sense that they understand the struggle. Most of us who've maybe been locked in a dark closet building backends for a long time really deeply want to build something that pleases customers, but we're so disconnected it's hard to understand what the problem is when it's translated through somebody who doesn't know what an API is. So making that connection that Keith's talking about, that's quintessentially what I'm getting at here, is make that connection between who's building your APIs and the customers who are using them in the field, which they're going to be developers, right? So let developers talk together and cool things happen. Making that happen in reality is very difficult. There's often an ocean of people in between those two individuals or two groups. Okay, I'm not rushing ahead now. I have a tendency to do that. All right. So number 3, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the last of the don'ts. I think I moved one of them to do. They can all be do or don't. It's all spin. It's about getting a good hook title. So building your own API management, I think this is like, it's weird because in some sense, like API management providers, you're it's like paying someone to open the fridge door for you every time you want a beer or something. It's like, why would I pay per call to do something? It seems nuts. But it's more than just a proxy. And this is where I think everybody gets lost when they look at So do you guys know what I'm talking about when I say API management?
Yeah.
Right? So the usual suspects are like 3Scale, Apogee, Mashery. Heard those names maybe? Okay. So these are basically things that sit in front of your API that do some magic for it. And I think a lot of developers take a passing glance and say, that's a proxy. It's a reverse proxy and that's all it does. I can do that myself. I'll stand up this thing and I'm done. And I would warn you that that is not true. There's a lot to it. Some of these things individually, if broken down, caching. Yes, you can do HTTP caching. You can put Nginx or Varnish as a reverse proxy. It's relatively easy. But can you write your own rate limiting algorithm that works at scale? It's hard. It's really, really hard to do that, right? Setting up policies and tiers and all that sort of like customer packaging of, you know, which partner gets access to which APIs when you start doing these sort of customized deals. When you add up all this stuff, it's a job. There's a reason they exist as companies, and there's a reason that, you know, there's some IPO value companies in there. It's hard.
But even if you, for some reason, want to do it yourself, it almost makes more sense to get to market fast by just partnering first.
Yeah.
And then slowly eat away at it if you feel like you don't want to pay every time.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like the speed to market piece of it, you're absolutely right. I mean, when I was at UShip, we ran into this exact question is like, we looked at it and said, we can do some of these things.
Sure.
I'm positive, like, and we don't need all those features. We can build enough of it, get it out there. But then we looked at a timeline of delivering that to the public. It was 6 months longer. And at the end of the day, that meant a lack of team focus.
Right.
If we're all busy troubleshooting API management layer issues, then maybe we're not as focused as we should be on what it is that we're building as a product that happens to have an API as its interface for developers. Traffic, you know, kind of, I really hate to say just like API call metrics, because frankly it should be, you should be looking at a lot more than that in terms of how your product works. I should have mentioned it in here, but KPIs for APIs by John Musser is an absolutely seminal work in understanding what you should be looking at. It's KPIs for APIs.
Ryan's.
It's a brilliant, brilliant presentation that absolutely like will change your perspective on how you look at it. If all you're doing today is call metrics, if your API management provider is just doing that, like there's a lot more, but you need at least the call metrics of how often are calls happening, on what routes are they happening, all that kind of stuff. It is a base entry-level thing. And I'll warn you, when you build it yourself, that part will always fall off the back button. You'll never really get it done right. It'll take you a long time to get to it, and by that time you will have missed a lot of insights as to how customers are using your product. There are a lot of advanced protections that being a service provider of APIs, you learn. And hang out with some of these, you know, Mastery, Apogee, 3Scale guys, and ask them what's the weirdest thing you've ever seen happen? They have some absolute horror stories of things you wouldn't have dreamed up that can happen. And they've built in protections into their system for dealing with it. If you do that yourself, you have to get good at all that, all those unknown things that you wouldn't have dreamt of. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it might not be as secure as it would be had you just used a vendor to do it. And if you're a very small, early stage thing and you suddenly have a PR fracas over a security issue, imagine being like a Snapchat where you built your own security implementation, you did everything yourself, and it turns out you didn't do that great of a job. And there's like naked celebrity photos floating around with your name on it in the press. It's not good. Had you just used someone else's built-in, you know, existing security model for doing those things and taken some advice, maybe it's not so bad. So these are things to consider as risks. And fundamentally, like, stick to what you're good at, you know? Like, you do something as your business that you're good at. This beaver is good at building his dam. He doesn't want to have to worry about, you know, producing the water supply from the glaciers. That's the sun's problem. Focus on what you're good at. Let somebody else deal with that problem would be my general advice. Because it turns into a staff. you have a staff dedicated to that problem that can't ever do anything else because they have to learn all the dark secrets of the world of proxy. And it's not fun. So I already mentioned some of the vendors in the space. I also am constantly highlighting, because I've been begging for it personally for years. I don't like paying per call for things at all, ever, but most of them are priced that way in some fashion or form. Kong is a open source project from Mashape, which it blows my mind that it's out there. It's awesome. The only trick to it, and the only reason that I think they haven't seen quite as much adoption is it's Nginx based, and it uses Lua, which if you haven't written Lua and you're not super comfortable, can be pretty intimidating. And I think for a lot of folks that's true.
Tick.io, tyk.io.
Yeah, TYK. There are many other vendors I did not list. I listed the big three names as
They have the
a
open
feeder.
source one, it's pretty sexy.
Is it?
Yep.
Oh, I forgot.
I tweeted the KPIs for APIs link from the Austin API account.
There you
If
go.
anyone's looking for it.
Cool. All right. So we're done with all the negatives. We're gonna shake it out. Those are all the don'ts. And there are more. I've certainly done enough picking on my collection of mistakes over the years, so there's plenty of presentations with more, but these are the high level things. So now we're gonna look at the do. These are the things like you should do, right? And you should do it from the start. These are the things that we haven't made mistakes yet. We're maybe rebooting and thinking about how we do it from the start. This is actually the one I moved from don't. So it could be don't skip comprehensive testing. But yeah, you should be doing that. The truth is, in my mind, there's no reason for production escapes. And if you don't use that terminology in your business, I'm saying you shouldn't have bugs that make it to production for your APIs. That should be like a 1% occurrence, very, very small probability. Because you should have built it based on the way that people use it with scenarios defined to test that. And if you didn't, then you've missed a huge opportunity. How many of you have written like web application testing? Yeah, I heard sighs and groans and ulcers groaning. Yeah, it sucks because it's so ambiguous. You can't quite map everything right, and you have to have this whole like methodology of how you map things to the buttons, or else it's going to be brittle. APIs are pretty straightforward. It's literally an object you can map things to in like an HTTP operation. You have no excuse for not doing it. Well, you may have an excuse for not doing it, which is cost and time and all those things, but you have no excuse for bugs to exist if you had that time and money. And hopefully you can advocate for it. So just to be clear, unit testing is great or it's not. I don't know, there's a lot of opinions. For the sake of this discussion, I don't care. Unit testing to me is for the developer building it to have confidence to make change. And that's fine. That's cool, that's great. That's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is the acceptance testing piece. Define how your API is expected to behave under real world circumstances. Make some definition of how the thing is expected to work, and actually have an HTTP client that makes those calls. So that if there are a series of calls that need to be made, and this is a pretty common scenario, right? Maybe you're lucky and you have an API that has like one get and one post, but for a lot of folks it's like, like say PayPal, like a billing subscriptions and plans. It's like a whole chain of things that has to happen and a whole life cycle to set up this billing plan. You really have to think about how does that work from beginning to end through the whole life cycle, and set up scenarios that test that all that actually works in reality to make it actually work. So the key here, and this is the part that I think a lot of devs miss, they get buried in the code and the implementation. You have to have something that makes an HTTP call to your implementation. And maybe more than one in the right order. It sounds revolutionary, but no. A lot of folks miss that. You have to do that, or you didn't actually know what would happen, because you could have perfect software that's implemented absolutely wonderful, and it turns out when you deploy it, there's some layer out in front of your API that wasn't configured right. And when you deploy the next change, it's not gonna be available to anybody and everything's broken. But you look at your server, well, all the metrics look good on my server, I'm fine. Good luck, DevOps guy. This will give you a more holistic view that the whole thing's working end to end once it's deployed. So a big part of this is how are you going to describe those scenarios? Again, if we take some complicated scenario that takes a whole series, a chain of events to prove that the whole life cycle works, even if you just take a CRUD API, I'm going to create, I'm going to read, I'm going to update, I'm going to delete. That's a series of events that are fundamentally dependent on one another to exist. You can't read something until you've created it. So you have to define these scenarios. In my experience, and I'm certainly a long-time advocate, is that sort of BDD, or behavioral driven development, is a great way to describe this. Because it also gives a common English language description for the whole team to agree on how the thing works. If you haven't looked at BDD, you can look for BDD or look for Cucumber. That was like the first big implementation. There are a lot of them out there now in every language and flavor you could imagine. I don't really care which one, but if you're looking for an easy start, I'm a big fan these days of Chakram. It's a Node-based or JavaScript, I don't know which, I guess it's probably Node. It basically pre-describes a DSL, a description language of how HTTP calls work, so that you don't have to do all that stuff on just a sort of base Cucumber implementation. So it does a lot of the not heavy lifting, but the simple lifting of making the HTTP calls for you.
So if you already were doing BDD sites, say you're a Python shop, but you have an API team and AngularJS team, and we're already doing Behave internally for that, does it make sense to adopt something that was built more for testing APIs, or at this point, no, just use what you're familiar with? Do you think
If it works, I don't know that from a business standpoint, I'd want to spend the money if it was my check to write.
What do you mean?
Like you're saying, should we go off and use some other framework and rebuild all of our testing?
Not all, but I'm just saying, is there an advantage of what you recommend, Chakram, that's very sort of REST API driven a little bit, that makes sense,
To me, like,
easier, or no?
it gives you a prepackaged set of phrases to use
I see.
to describe how the call works,
'Cause it's-
and it does the HTTP calls for you.
Yeah.
Frankly, that part's not that tough.
Yeah.
The hard part is all the weird things that your API does and all the weird things that your business does, and making that stuff work smoothly with a phrase to describe it in
So
software
you're
that
already
tests it
doing another
properly.
form of BDD for the purpose.
Yeah,
of
so if you've already gone through the work
to-
of making calls work in a language that you're comfortable with, I go with it, because the rest is the hard work.
Okay.
Does this make sense?
Does it have any support for data dictionaries if you're doing integration APIs?
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a year-old project. So, and I don't think, well, I would say this, that, again, I've done long talks on the testing piece, there's a lot to it. This is the starting point kind of stuff, but I would say that JSON schema is certainly a choice. It may not be the best choice, but it's a choice for how to validate your sort of responses or your requests. That JSON schema could be subordinate to, say, a Swagger or OpenAPI specification. That's another way to do that, right? Is that if you've defined, and so I'm starting to use Swagger and OpenAPI interchangeably, because if you haven't noticed in the API news, right, the CNN of API, that Swagger is now called OpenAPI specification. There's sort of a big Linux Foundation thing that happened a couple of months ago, and that's just starting to kind of get off the ground and rolling. A number of big companies got involved, really just so that we could bring some money to the party and get the thing off the ground. I think everybody seems to have really good intentions. It's going along well so far. I'm part of that. The only reason I bring it up is if you haven't looked, go look for OpenAPI specification. It's out there, it's a thing. It means the same thing as Swagger today, but I think at some point in the near future that will start to deviate. And Swagger will be just sort of a tool name artifact. At any rate, if you're using something like Swagger or RAML or API Blueprint, these specification formats, you can also include schema that defines how your requests and responses are expected to work, using that schema to validate your actual calls happening is a good approach. It's not 100%, but it's about 90-95%. There's some fuzzing stuff you really want to do to get it perfect, but it's a great starting point. All right. The number 2 do, and I said I would come back to this earlier, is listen to customers. Not really that crazy of an idea, but what I want to kind of get you thinking about is that this is not a static state. So we want to listen before we build something, rather than we're going to go off into the lab with the marker board, dream up the perfect API, draw it out on the board, everybody runs off and writes code. That might not be the smartest way to go about things, because you may find that you didn't really realize how your customers wanted to use your APIs if they could dream them existing. Sometimes they'll also make up ideas that are crazy, and you shouldn't do that either, but get lots of feedback and you'll find the common threads that help you build that right MVP. So find out what those critical use cases are. What are the things that your customers are most frequently asking for? Use those as sort of, here's what I'm going to go off with the baseline. This is what I want to make sure works. These 5, 6, 12, 20, whatever it is, use cases that are the core of what we think we should be doing. And I would recommend, get what I call on-the-ground feedback, is like talk to the actual, hopefully developers, if not, whoever it is that's the sort of direct buying customer for who might be using this, to find out their opinions on the matter. Surveys and all that stuff, they're great. They're very powerful as like a big data, like a lot of data points. But sometimes in those conversations, you'll hear little things that you didn't think of before. And ultimately, write stories. I assume you're all doing this sort of agile thing, right? You say that you're working on stories, but they tend to be tasks. So write a story. We talked before about testing, that the scenario is what counts. What are the chain of events that happen to make it valuable? Write a story and then break that down into implementable pieces. So the point is, find out the story of what your customers want. Does anyone recognize the image? I didn't see any eyes flicker yet. Hubble, you're on to something.
Before they fixed it.
Before they fixed it. Here they are fixing it. Okay, good.
Just one real quick comment. That sure sounds like a product owner's job.
Sure. Anybody work directly in product management, or you do the job and you feel like you're doing it for free? Yeah, okay. Well, I would say this. I stated before that I think a lot of the product management world is struggling on how to deal with APIs, and I think for developers on those teams, to some extent, it's on you to teach them. And they're looking for ways of, how do I do this in a scalable fashion, in a way that I can read it in English, in a way that you can tell me what the hell you're building, so that I can see tests turn green and pass, and know that I have confidence that you built the right thing, right?
So when you say custom, right, so the immediate user of the API is typically a developer that's going to
I'm
implement, right?
being totally vague when I say customer.
Right, so, but then there's usually the developer itself is implementing this API to do that, then there's a finally paying customer. So from an API team, who do you call the customer? Is it your consumer of your API, in this case the developer integrates? Or is it running a story that goes beyond that and says the user and then how they get, which one?
I
Or
think the
both?
client developers who we've been talking about primarily so far, in terms of writing the story,
For
that
developer
probably
experience.
depends. I mean, the spectrum of different possibilities here are huge. Some things end consumers will never see. These are like
Right,
pure
exactly.
B2B backend things,
Right.
and it's not even in the mix. Other things, when that API call happens, there's an async process in a browser waiting for it to finish, and then something changes. So write the scenario as it happens, and then that'll kind of tell you. It's always different. So you've gotten some initial feedback. You're going to go off and build the thing. You're getting the ball rolling. So sync up with that early group of folks that you talked to on what it is that they wanted, and offer them up some mocks. Now, obviously, this is really kind of scary choices to make. I'm going to show my customers something that's not even built yet, what it might look like. I hope it's technically feasible. So choose those customers wisely. Figure out, you might not want to go with your biggest money, giant partner type customers who you might risk the whole relationship. There's a relationship management piece in there, but ultimately like find out from the right kind of close relationship, understanding folks that you have some ongoing trust with. Offer them up some mocks and say, show this to your devs. Compared to our existing APIs or compared to our new APIs, does this feel like the right kind of thing? So when I say mocks, I'm saying an API that answers on the URL to your get, post, put, delete, patch, whatever, with fake responses. And that's valuable because from sort of usability kind of testing, if we consider that developer experience is just another flavor of usability, that giving someone a document, especially a developer, and saying read it, good luck. They're probably not going to read very much of it. But if you give them an API to call, even if it's fake, they'll write some code and try it out and see if they can map it to their existing data and then find out in a tactile feedback way what's really true and false. So the mocks are a pretty powerful construct. And there's a lot of, if you're using the Swagger Ramble blueprint kind of stuff, there's some existing libraries that kind of make that a cheap investment for you, stand up a fake API based on examples. So if there are other pieces that you're working on, do those previews, get those early feedback pieces. Don't build in a vacuum because it can become caustic. You can kind of get into a mode of building something that no one really asked for and not finding out until too late. And then everyone plays the blame game and fights each other, and it's not good. So early feedback is good. Keep it to the right community of customers. And in that process, you're going to find out who you really like as customers, who you really trust, who you have a good working relationship with, and maybe see if there's partnership opportunities. That may look different for everybody in this room, but basically some way to sort of sink that hook further from both sides in a way that you both benefit greater. Now, your business models are all probably totally different, but basically find a way to escalate that relationship in the process of giving them early access to things. I see a lot of furrowed brows. I totally lost a bunch of people. What have we lost on? Partners? Who does partner-based APIs? Anyone? Okay. So when I say partner, I mean you might have public APIs or private APIs that do a given level of access to certain things. Your public stuff is usually much lower. Your internal stuff is really scary high. Partner stuff usually comes in somewhere in the middle. You've got some company, let's say Facebook calls you and says, we want your product to have a feature with a widget on Facebook. What would you do to get that business, right? You'll give them more access. You'll give them more things than your public API does. That's partner stuff. So you'll find those things in the process of this feedback loop that can be a really good way for both parties to get something more out of it. But as I point out here, careful because the deadlines tend to come with these things. They'll make a deal with you, but you got to do it by a certain time.
Question, you were saying earlier about providing a worker API instead of documentation. I heard examples.
I didn't say instead.
Or, yeah, that it's better than just documentation.
Both is best.
What about what I've heard some people doing that provide also a complete test suite that runs from that client perspective, testing that API, so that as they integrate, they can see it working from what you've done instead of, maybe they misuse it, say they don't work. Is that?
It sounds like a bad idea.
You haven't seen much.
It's only as
think
good
it
as your
sounds
fake
scary.
data, though.
Huh?
It's only as good as your fake data.
Yeah. Right, but I'm just saying it.
Part of it too is that a lot of APIs end up where even if you have something public, there's sneaky, tricky stuff that you can do internally with it that your external folks can't see. So quite often the tests are too tainted to turn over.
Yeah, I wouldn't want anyone to see my acceptance test because the way we use it and the way you should use it.
Yeah, you always end up doing sketchy things to make all that
Yes.
linkage work that you would have to explain.
Isn't that a
right?
problem?
Like
sort
we're-
of?
I mean, I think
Functionality,
fundamentally
not
if you
just
have
the use.
a really elegant, nice, English readable way to describe what your API does, and it doesn't have any nasty internal bits in it, can't see that that would be bad, but I haven't seen that happen yet.
We're publishing ours.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wrote BDD testing all of our helper libraries and we're releasing that. Tried to get it out this week, it just didn't happen.
Very nice.
So,
What was the motivation for this?
so we work with a lot of enterprises and we want to give them confidence that things are working as expected. And from a customer support perspective, when something breaks, instead of them just saying it's you, we can say, here's some tests to run to say, is the API behaving as expected? So now we can very politely say, no, it's you.
Actually, you had it,
Yeah, so we've been working on it probably since about August or
Yeah,
so.
great.
I mean, that's a core happy path, it's not your boundary test, it's not.
No, it's
Yeah.
not, like, it's here's how you should use
Use
this.
it, yeah.
And we do test a handful of common error
It's almost like
conditions.
live doc.
The good thing with
And it's all BDD driven, so we publish.
Yeah,
publish
with the
all of it.
BDD stuff, pretty much all the frameworks have a tagging system where you can basically tag a scenario. So like a common thing is, before long you hit the scenario that sucks, where it runs, half of your test execution time is like this 1 or 2 scenarios that take a really long time. So you put a slow tag on them, and you only run them once a night instead of every CI commit. Or you have like a regression tag that you only run once a night instead of all day long. So I would imagine you could have like a releasable tag you would
public
hand over to
facing.
folks. Yeah. All right. So now you've gotten some feedback, you've gone through feedback loops, you've built the thing up, maybe you picked some partners up along the way. Now you have a living, breathing thing in sharp, nice resolution because the lens was fixed. Sorry, space nerd. Now we have to focus on this production feedback loops. So this is, again, we're talking about listening to customers. We talked about this before, where are the developers? Go find out where they're at and listen to them gripe and be polite. And more importantly, I think when you launch the API, be prepared that you need to dedicate, if not dedicated staff, you need to dedicate some portion of your developers' time to doing this stuff. As Keith had said, like maybe it's a day a week that you go do this. And it's probably healthy that they do. I mentioned before, fix bugs is a top priority. Clearly there's a lot of overlap here with the don'ts from earlier. Listening to customers kind of starts to bake into a lot of things if you're looking at it right. And ultimately, beyond the bugs, make sure that the feedback helps you. If you can't fix it today, that those things get higher priority in your backlog if customers asked for it than if your developers dreamed it up. It's probably higher value. Always. All right. And as the final point of listening to customers, we're going to stalk them like an angry murder cat. Anybody read The Oatmeal?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, murder cats. Sorry. It's like totally makes sense because I've always had murder cats, cats that kill things for sport. Anyways, so find out who are your top users. When I say users in this context, I could be saying customers, I could be saying developers. Kind of depends, but it tends to be whatever that account relationship is. Find out who the top ones are and find out who the bottom ones are. Who never succeeded? They intended to make a call and all they got was error codes. Chances are you can do some pretty simple algorithms to detect in the first 48 hours after they signed up, all they got was error codes. And I know what that error code means and I know what they're doing wrong. And I can email them and let them know what they did wrong. Magic stuff. Yeah, so you can actually automate some of this stuff. It's not possible. But the point is, like I said before, figure out what your business model is, figure out what analytics you should be looking at, what sort of KPIs you should be looking at that determine your API success, and dig into those things to figure out how do you push the top end up and how do you push the bottom end up, meaning those who are performing well, how can you help them perform better, and those at the bottom level, how can you actually get them working at all so that they don't quit and use someone else easier? Good? Customer feedback loops? That's good. All right. Last thing I think on the do's is we're building APIs for humans and machines. This is like, I think, in listening to stuff on like robotics and drones, it seems like these topics come up as like, should we build things for humans or for machines? And it's like, you're doing it for both, right? That's APIs. They work fundamentally in production for the sake of the machines. The software's talking to each other. But it doesn't exist unless developers use it, and they have an experience when that happens. And that experience could be very positive or it could be very negative. You know, find a few hashtags that reference some popular APIs and go watch Twitter for a while, and it's a feed of emotion. That was an awesome experience I had today. It was so freaking easy. In 5 minutes, I got my blah working. Or, God, I hate this. Why did I get a PDF, and why did I have to wait for a salesperson to call me to use it? So, I think that the biggest thing, and this is along the lines of consistency, which certainly in the developers world, you know, we're all a little somewhere in the like autism, super obsessed, focused perspective, is everything should look and feel the same. If I'm calling the API and I read the documentation and I go look at the guidance and I look at the code samples and there's 4 different terms that describe the same thing, I'm the kind of person that's gonna draw issues to me, that this company doesn't really know what they're making. They don't really know what to call it, and I don't have great confidence that they know their business. So using consistent vocabulary, super critical. Describe things the same way pervasively and check yourself on it. Also, the internal lingo has a way of leaking its way in there. Terms that you use to describe how you do business that you don't realize are ways that no one else calls it, or only like super industry insiders use it. Trust me, in the payments world, there's like a million of these things. We use these acronyms and fling them around, and people just expect that everyone knows what it is. But when you have somebody who's building, you know, a shopping cart and they just want to make payments work, they don't know what all those terms mean. It doesn't mean anything to them. So try not to use the abbreviations, try not to use the industry lingo. Sometimes you have to. If you have to, put it in the description of that field or of that object or whatever it is. Make sure that folks know what the heck that abbreviation or lingo means. And SDKs too. I forgot that one. So my biggest pet peeve in the world these days is the term developer experience. So some of you raise your hands that you work in developer experience. So does that mean that you build a developer portal? Yes? Yeah. See, healthy perspective. That's good. Developer experience is a lot more than a portal site. It's a lot more than building a web application that looks good to developers. That is just the starting point. It's a lot more than just writing accurate reference documentation and accurate samples and guidance. It's what would the client code look like if somebody called this API? And what could I change in this API design that would produce less client code? These are really hard habits to get into, and it's a weird skill to develop, to look at an API and quickly imagine what the code looks like. So if you're not in that habit and you don't have that skill, which most of us don't, you can sometimes do the dog fooding thing people call it, is eat your own dog food. If you built an API, use it. So if you built an API to ship things and you happen to need to ship things, you can use it. A lot of cases I find that doesn't work because especially in the microservices kind of ideology, you build things internally that, I don't need that. I'm at PayPal, I don't really need a payments API to pay for things that much. In the majority of situations, it's useless for us. So build sample applications. You'd be surprised sitting down for an afternoon making, it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be great, some kind of a little sample application that calls the API that you're designing, again, maybe against a mock, maybe you haven't built it yet. You use it very early on to find out what that client code looks like and realize all the things living as a client, what stinks about the way that you designed your API. Maybe I had to do 3 calls to accomplish something that I could roll up into one endpoint. You won't find those things out until you experience that tactile feedback. We mentioned earlier that HTTP friendliness, meaning like, does your API do things that are compatible with HTTP, that take advantage of caching, that take advantage of e-tags and all these other crazy things. Being like, you'll hear people say, oh, that's not truly RESTful. It's not. It didn't use the RFC, blah, blah, blah. Everyone's striking a balance between what produces nice client code and what's like perfectly RESTful or HTTP friendly, as I like to say. It's a hard balance to strike, but if you're not feeling that you're tipping that balance somewhere, you're not pushing hard enough for good client code. It's kind of like if you're not cheating, you're not trying hard, try to cheat a little bit somewhere that doesn't hurt too bad. Consider SDKs. See, okay. So that is a big component in developer experience. If the majority of your developers happen to be, say, college students, you may not know that when you launch it, but it may turn out that you built a great research tool, or you built something that's really cheap. And so it's useful in college hack projects, which could turn into big companies. That's, you know, there's some maybe viable strategy there, I don't know. But if you do, you may find out they have incredibly bad HTTP literacy. They don't understand how HTTP works beyond typing in a URL and hitting enter in the browser. And that's not enough to make APIs work effectively on the web with proxies and caches and intermediaries and all these things, right? So SDKs give you the ability to make it easier so that those less experienced developers can go download a library, copy paste a code sample, and the API works, and they change out their keys only if you force them, otherwise they'll use the sample one that you gave them. And they're happier, and maybe you picked up on somebody with a bright idea, right? The point is that the sort of lower end of the spectrum may not be as comfortable with more advanced HTTP concepts, like passing a header. Anybody not passed a header in an HTTP request before? It's okay, be honest, there's somebody in here. All right. You'd be shocked how often that's a question. It's like, I've used curl, I'm really good at curl, but how do you pass a header? So the point is, like, SDKs can wrap up a little bit of that perceived complexity. And I would also point out that I think from my research, I think SDK usage is slowly going down and raw HTTP calls are slowly going up. So I think literacy is on the rise, people are learning. It's weird. I think it's true. I'm not saying to eliminate them, I'm not saying it's a bad strategy to move away from. I'm saying you should not count on SDKs to cover, to like sweep all the dirt under the rug.
So are you saying they're coming on the rise but still leveraging independent libraries? Or what do you mean by that?
Is this based on data or gut?
Yeah.
Or can you describe, when you say it's like, instead of leveraging what you provide as an SDK, they're just using general libraries and then consuming your API through that, or?
Like a raw HTTP library, basically?
Is that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, like say in Python requests.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
like
That's
that
what-
kind of
because
stuff.
nobody's gonna go and do the
I think part of
raw
it is,
stuff.
I think part of it is the HTTP libraries are getting better.
That's why, that's what I'm
Like
saying.
they
If that's
sound
what you're saying,
like
that
if
makes
you
sense.
tried to write Java HTTP calls 3 or 4 years ago, that's pretty gross. There's a
So-
lot better stuff for it now.
I'm confused. I thought a while back you said, don't use an SDK, use something like Apogee, because getting all that stuff right is difficult.
So an
I'm just confused.
SDK is an abstraction to make a call for the client. The API management vendor, from the API client's perspective, is invisible. They don't know it exists. So those are kind of a different level of concerns. The client is writing code to call your API on api.capitalfactory.com, right?
So Apogee is still there, it's just hidden.
It's there,
you're
but it's a
saying.
transparent
Okay.
proxy, yeah.
Got it.
So it's adding in some magic sauce, you know, behind the scenes that the client doesn't really need to know
That's
about.
good, okay.
Yeah, so there's definitely no correlation between those two. Completely independent levers you can pull. All right, let's wrap it up, and that's a picture of a cake, so we're gonna wrap it up with cake, which makes it tastier. So,
The cake is alive.
what I think, I honestly did this as like a self-exercise of like bundling up all the things I felt like I had learned and was confident in. And what I realized is all I was really describing is the product management piece of APIs. Is that ultimately these things are products. Now, are they standalone products that are separate from your existing products? Maybe. Are they an amendment to your existing product? Maybe. It's a little bit different everywhere. And I'm gonna point at John Musser again. 20 business models in 20 minutes, 20 API business models in 20 minutes. Another fantastic talk. John Musser's research is on the level to understand how your product is a product, how product relates to an API. But ultimately, you have to manage the thing. And as we've already established, there's not a high confidence level in API product managers across the industry. So to some extent, as developers, we need to be filling in the gaps on these things. And I think a lot of seasoned developers are doing this as a force of habit, kind of filling in that role. So a lot of these things look a lot like any other product management field. You should be conducting market research, right? You're going out and looking at other APIs to see how yours might fit. It's okay to do that as long as you have good fundamentals. You're doing customer feedback, timely and helpful support. That's a huge component of rolling out a new product, making sure that you have that support to land on rather than launching it and then realizing you didn't do anything. And ultimately, all along the way, building relationships with customers that ultimately give you a leg up against the competition. We could probably swap out APIs and put other things in here, and it's the same stuff. I think that's what we just reviewed. There are certainly nuances to APIs that are a little bit different, like, you know, other folks don't have to worry about API management vendors or other things along the way. But ultimately, I think like that's what I want to make sure that anybody that's building APIs is thinking about. This is not just a developer thing. This is not a thing we put out there for developers. There's a lot of other considerations involved. There are business folks on the other end, you know, at your customers beyond the developers who may be involved in making the decision to use you or not. There's a whole relationship involved. You know, I think one thing nobody says is that in many programs, the wide swath of your developers make you no money at all. They just cost you money. But a handful of very valuable relationships make you a whole lot of money. So finding those high quality relationships and feeding them, that's where a lot of growth comes from in a lot of these very successful programs. So the only way to do that is through kind of a traditional product chain. So if you're a developer and I'm telling you to be a product manager and you feel angry at me, I'll be at the back drinking beer afterwards. So thanks a lot. So we do have a hard stop at 9. I ran way long, sorry. So enjoy yourself. Bathrooms are on the corner.
Let's do a quick wrap up first. You're not in charge anymore. You don't get to do that.
Sorry. Let's have it.
So before we leave tonight, we do have to be out in about 25 minutes or so. But I do want to say who's hiring. If you're hiring, stand up. We'll do one by one. I want 3 things from you. Here's my name. Here's who I work for. Here's what we're looking for. Go.
David Marrera, Newcomling FinTech company, hiring a senior Python developer / lead, BA, and mostly the stuff you probably care about. So.
Dan.
Dan D. Flippy, we're at Own Local. We work with publishers to make them more money, and we do SEO stuff. We have huge APIs. We're looking for senior, junior engineers, product manager, project manager. Pretty much, we're doubling the size of our company this year, so we're hiring for pretty much everything.
Cool. Taylor.
Hi, I'm Taylor from Keen.io. Keen.io is data analytics API. We're hiring 2 different positions, a platform engineer. Keen's based in San Francisco, but I work remotely here in Austin, and we have many remote employees. And then a DevOps engineer also.
Bonnie, I work at Context.io. Context.io is a email API in which, given a set of credentials, you can access email as a RESTful resource. So imagine opening up someone's essential life as a data source for your application. That's what Context does. We're looking for a DevOps engineer. There are a lot of really interesting ops challenges. We're on the kind of leading edge of ops stuff. If you're interested, talk to me.
Excellent. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ed. I work for WP Engine. We're a specialized hosting provider that specializes in WordPress. And we are hiring a number of different engineers at different levels. We're really desperately looking for big data engineers, if you know anybody. And but API as well, we're looking to expose more of our guts to our customers, so we're increasing the enterprise level.
Thank you.
Aren't you being approved? Can you describe us as we're competitor for PayPal?
In your face. She's coming for you.
We're specifically looking for iOS devs and senior architects, specifically PHP. So we got several members of our team here tonight.
Rob.
I'm Rob. I'm from Outbound Engine. I'm the VP of Product. I'm looking for one of those elusive technical product managers who is really facile with APIs. We work with other people's APIs, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Full Contact, QuickBooks. We mine those for information for our core business, which is automating the delivery of email and social media marketing on behalf of local businesses.
I'm Drew with Allo. We actually manufacture LED lighting controllers. So we're actually, Glenn and I are actually more embedded programmers, a little different. We actually have a current need. Our Python programmer fell in love and literally moved out of the country. So I need about 2 to 10 hours to get us out of trouble. We do need some, the person was actually full-time, so we are looking to fill that position. And also, we just announced 3 months ago the first true LED light switches and dimmers. We have an API for interfacing. By the way, they're DC driven. We're taking lighting from being AC to being DC. So we are looking. We have built some API backend. We're looking to interface it to the real world. So that's the second part. But primarily, I'm desperate.
All right, last not least.
I'm Bill Kleinberger, hi, with social care. Socialcare.com, because I like to get out of the stream. We're looking for Java front end and back end, experienced program software development.
Excellent. So one last note is the 2 presentations that Jason mentioned during his presentation from John Musser. I've tweeted out both of those from the Austin API account. So if you're looking for those slides, they're already out there. And I tagged John Musser on Twitter too. So if you're interested in following what he's working on, he's a brilliant, brilliant guy. I've been thinking about this stuff longer than we've been even doing it.
He's also like a strategic consultant for APIs. So.
Yeah, fantastic guy. He was here for API Strike a couple months ago. Lots of fun. But beyond that, we have beverages. Please enjoy. If you're looking for a job, please reach out to one of the people that stood up today. Yes?
Will the slides for this presentation be available on the site?
Yeah.
I'll put it up and tweet it out.
Yeah. And then I'll tweet it from Austin API. So, yeah. So, any final questions? Going once, going twice. One note, we are looking for a speaker for February. We'll probably skip March because there's this big event in town, I guess. And then come back in April. So if you have an idea for speakers, please let me know. Please enjoy beverages and meet somebody you don't know. Thank you.